horror. 20 women and 10 men missing in Fish Lagoon. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Have you ever wondered how a quiet American town, where everyone knows each other, could suddenly become the stage for disappearances so chilling they left families broken and a whole community living in fear? Tonight, we'll walk you through the shadows of the Mississippi Delta, through the ponds, the farms, and the long nights where investigators uncovered secrets darker than the river itself. If you love true crime stories that are not only gripping but also heartfelt, reminding us of the value of every single life, then stay with us until the end. And don't forget, hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we bring to life. On a damp spring evening in 2023, the town of Belzoni, Mississippi, looked like it always had. The neon sign of the River Bend Bar buzzed weakly against the mist rising from the Yazoo River. A few trucks were parked out front, mud still clinging to their tires from the fields. Inside, the jukebox played old country tunes, the kind of music that mixed with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. To the locals, it was just another Thursday night. Among the regulars was Roy Jenkins, a man in his mid-50s who had spent most of his life drifting from job to job. Some called him a carpenter, others a laborer, but everyone knew him for one thing: the bottle. Roy was the kind of man who always had a story when he was drunk, and he was always drunk. He'd been seen arguing with his grown daughter weeks earlier about finding steady work, but that night at River Bend, he seemed at peace, laughing with two men over shots of bourbon. Around 11 o'clock, Roy pushed himself off the bar stool, waved a sloppy goodbye, and stepped out into the warm night. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stumbled toward the levee road. Heading home, he muttered, though no one saw him take the usual turn toward his shack on the edge of town. By morning, Roy Jenkins was gone. At first, no one thought much of it. Folks in the Delta were used to men like Roy disappearing for a few days, maybe sleeping it off in a hunting shack or riding along with a trucker friend. His family called the sheriff's office, but the deputy who answered the phone shrugged it off. "He'll turn up," he said. "They always do." But Roy didn't turn up. Not that night. Not the next. Not ever. The town whispered at first. Some said he might have hitchhiked north to Memphis, others that he'd fallen into the river after too many drinks. But as days stretched into weeks, the whispers began to carry unease. The Yazoo had swallowed many things over the years: old cars, fishing nets, even a few unlucky souls, but it rarely kept secrets for long. And yet, with Roy, there was no body, no trace, not even a boot caught in the reeds. By the time summer rolled around, Roy's disappearance had already begun to fade from conversation, just another sad story of a man who couldn't escape his vices. But for those who knew him, the daughter he disappointed, the barmaid who always poured him one last drink, it was a hole left open, a question with no answer. And in Belzoni, a town that prided itself on being small enough that everybody knew everybody, the silence surrounding Roy Jenkins began to feel unnatural. No one knew it yet, but Roy wasn't the first man the Delta would lose that year, and he would not be the last. His vanishing was the first ripple in what would become a wave of fear washing over the quiet backroads and catfish ponds of Humphreys County. It was late April of 2023 when the next disappearance unsettled the quiet rhythm of the Delta. The dogwoods had already dropped their blossoms, and the thick air smelled of rain and fertilizer. In the small town of Isola, just 10 miles from Belzoni, Martha Ellison lived alone in a clapboard house with peeling white paint, its front porch sagging with age. Martha was 48, a widow for nearly 5 years. Her husband had died in a highway crash on Route 49, leaving her with no children and few relatives nearby. Most of her family had long since moved to Tennessee. To the neighbors who saw her walking to church on Sundays, she seemed quiet but steady. She tended her yard, hung laundry on the line, and brought pies to potlucks. Still, there was a sadness about her on weeknights. The glow of a single lamp was often the only sign of life in her little house. On the morning she disappeared, her neighbor Sarah Collins noticed something off. She had walked over to borrow sugar, but when she knocked, there was no answer. The curtains were drawn tight, and the house felt strangely still. Sarah lingered a moment, uneasy, because just 2 nights earlier she thought she saw a man's shadow move past Martha's back fence. She had dismissed it at the time, thinking it was her imagination. Now the memory unsettled her. Later that day, when Martha's cousin from Memphis called and got no reply, concern grew. By evening, Sarah and 2 neighbors stood on the porch calling Martha's name. Still nothing. They phoned the sheriff's office. Deputy Rachel Nguyen arrived after dusk. She was known for her patience and thoroughness. She circled the house with a flashlight, finding both doors locked from the inside. Finally, she forced the door. Sarah covered her mouth as the hinges groaned open. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. A pot of tea sat cold on the stove. A half-finished quilt was folded neatly on a chair. Martha's purse hung by the door with her wallet and ID untouched. There was no overturned furniture, no broken glass. It was as if the woman had been lifted from her life in mid-step. The sheriff's office filed a missing persons report. Flyers went up on telephone poles. At church that Sunday, Pastor Avery asked the congregation to pray. But beneath the prayers lay fear. Martha was not like Roy Jenkins, the drunk who might have stumbled into trouble. She was a respected widow. Her vanishing felt different, more deliberate. Detective Marcus Hale drove out the next morning. He moved slowly through the rooms, searching for the thing that didn't fit. In the back bedroom, he paused at a window. The screen had been carefully removed. Along the sill, a faint smear of river mud clung to the wood. Someone had been there. Someone cautious. He kept that thought to himself. Driving back to Belzoni along the levee road, Marcus thought of Roy. One disappearance might be misfortune. 2 in less than a month, one of them, a woman with no enemies, hinted at something else. A predator. Search parties spread across the bayous. Bloodhounds from a prison unit tracked her scent only as far as the riverbank. Volunteers scoured the swamps, pulling old tires from the mud, stumbling upon deer bones, but nothing that belonged to Martha. Her house stood locked up, silent each time Sarah passed. Some evenings she swore she saw movement behind the curtains, but she knew it was just her fear playing tricks. The absence weighed heavy. By early summer, whispers spread at diners and gas stations. Human trafficking, some said. The river, others claimed. But in the hush of back porch conversations, one possibility lingered. What if someone was taking them? Marcus heard those whispers. Sitting on his porch at night, he replayed the image of that muddy windowsill in his mind. Someone had been there, and whoever it was, he feared they had only just begun. By June of 2023, the quiet talk around Humphreys County had shifted into open fear. 1 disappearance was troubling, 2 felt wrong. But when the list grew longer, people began locking their doors at night, something Delta families rarely did. The 3rd case came in early June. Earl Slim Walker, 50 years old, was known in Belzoni for his lanky frame and his drinking. Once a farmhand, he had slipped into hard times. Most evenings he sat near the levee, sipping from a bottle. Folks pitied him more than they feared him. One muggy Friday night, Slim was seen leaving a liquor store on Hayden Street, staggering with a paper bag. A fisherman remembered watching him drift toward the boat ramp by the river. That was the last anyone saw of him. His bed at the boarding house stayed cold. His landlady reported him missing. 2 weeks later, another name was added. Janice Moore, a 60-year-old widow from Silver City. Known as Miss Jan, she lived quietly, growing vegetables and baking pies for the farmer's market. One evening, a neighbor stopped by and found her garden gate swinging, the kitchen window cracked open, and a casserole cooling untouched on the counter. Janice was gone. By late summer, Henry Hank Dalton, a 49-year-old handyman, disappeared too. Hank had been struggling after a messy divorce, taking odd jobs in Isola. He was last seen leaving the River Bend bar with a stranger in a flat-bottom boat. By morning, his tools were still stacked by the door of his shed, but Hank had vanished. Within 9 months of Roy Jenkins's disappearance, the list had grown past a dozen. The cases carried the same unnerving traits. The victims lived alone, left behind no clear trail, and were swallowed by silence. No ransom notes, no phone activity, no bodies. Each story began with an ordinary day and ended in nothingness. Detective Marcus Hale spread the files across his desk in Belzoni. Photos of the missing driver's licenses, church portraits, snapshots from family albums stared back at him. He pinned their homes on a county map. Slowly, a shape emerged. The pins clustered in a rough triangle: Belzoni, Isola, and Silver City, all hugging the Yazoo River and its backwaters. It looked less like coincidence and more like territory. Marcus tapped the map with his pen. "This isn't random," he said to Deputy Rachel Nguyen, who leaned over his shoulder. "Somebody knows this ground. Somebody knows who won't be noticed right away." Rachel studied the map. "It's like someone's choosing the loneliest ones," she said softly. The sheriff's office traded theories. Some deputies suspected drug deals gone bad. Others muttered about trafficking rings along Highway 49. Marcus wasn't convinced. Drug dealers left bodies. Traffickers made demands. These cases ended in silence. By midsummer, the pressure mounted. Pastor Avery held vigils, inviting families to light candles for their missing. The Clarion Ledger sent reporters from Jackson. Headlines warned, "Delta disappearances baffle authorities." Fear seeped into daily life. Parents kept teenagers off the levee. Widows double-locked windows and kept shotguns by their beds. Old-timers swore the Yazoo was cursed. Marcus carried the weight of the families. He sat in kitchens that smelled of cornbread and coffee, listening to wives and cousins tell their stories. Each was different, yet painfully alike. A man stepped out for a drink and never returned. A woman left supper cooling on the stove and never ate it. At night, Marcus walked his porch, staring across the flat delta fields. This land stretched wide, but somehow, in all that space, people were vanishing without a trace. One evening, driving the levee road, he watched the river slide black under the sunset. Predators, he thought, follow patterns. They know where to hunt, who to stalk, and how to leave no evidence. Back in his office, Marcus circled the triangle of pins. He didn't yet know the who or the how, but deep down he knew one thing. This wasn't chance. This was design, and unless they found the hunter, more names would soon join the map. By early autumn of 2023, the air over the Mississippi Delta carried more than heat. In Belzoni, Isola, and Silver City, families lived in quiet dread. Pickup trucks slowed past lonely farmhouses. Porch lights glowed long into the night. And at the sheriff's office, Detective Marcus Hale sat hunched over his desk, staring at the triangle of pins that marked each missing soul. There were 13 names now. 13 people in less than a year, men who had drowned their lives in liquor, women who had buried their husbands and now lived in silence, people who could vanish without the world making noise. Marcus tapped his pen against the desk and muttered, "This isn't chance." Deputy Rachel Nguyen stepped in with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee. "You need this," she said, sliding one toward him. Marcus barely looked up. 13 victims, that's not coincidence, that's hunting. Rachel sat across from him, eyes tracing the map. "We've been treating them as single cases, but laid out like this." She stopped. The pins spoke louder than words. Marcus thought of the mud streak on Martha Ellison's windowsill, the garden gate left open at Janice Moore's, the fisherman who swore Slim Walker drifted toward the river and never returned. Too many signs, too careful. Whoever it was, the hand was deliberate. That afternoon, Marcus drove to Jackson to meet Special Agent Troy McAllister of the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. McAllister was younger than expected, sharp-eyed, with the clipped confidence of someone who had seen hard cases. In a conference room lined with state maps, Marcus spread the files. "Not just missing drunks and widows," he said. "It's a pattern. Somebody is choosing them." McAllister flipped through the folders, pausing at the photographs. "You're suggesting a serial predator in Humphreys County." "I'm not suggesting," Marcus replied. "I've worked here 15 years. People run off sometimes, yes. But this?" He tapped the cluster of pins. "This is design." McAllister leaned back. "Serial killers in the Delta, it's something you read in novels." "Tell that to the families," Marcus shot back. After a pause, McAllister nodded. "All right. We'll open a joint task force. But patterns alone won't hold. We'll need evidence." The task force began quietly. A few FBI agents joined the sheriff's office. They reviewed phone records, bank accounts, last known sightings. Dogs were brought in again to track near the river. Divers dragged oxbow lakes. The state crime lab retested fibers and soil samples. Yet the predator stayed a ghost. No footprints, no fibers, no usable witness statements. It was as if the land itself had swallowed people whole. In Belzoni, Sheriff Don Callahan faced a crowd at a town hall. Mothers, farmers, pastors, all pressed him with questions. Callahan's face glistened under the fluorescent lights. "We are pursuing every lead," he said. "We will bring answers." But his words fell flat. One man shouted, "How many more, Sheriff?" The room buzzed with anger. The press took notice. What had started as local reporting now reached Jackson, then Memphis, then even national headlines. Mystery in the Delta, vanishings in Humphreys County. Callahan fielded calls from the governor's office, demanding progress. The weight of politics pressed in. Driving home one evening, Marcus steered along the Levee Road, the Yazoo River sliding dark under the fading Sunday. The wide-open land that once felt like home now seemed suffocating, as if danger hid in plain sight. On his porch later, he sat with a beer untouched. He thought of his father, who had drowned during the 2011 flood when the levee broke, a life swept away without warning. That memory haunted him now, because people in his county were vanishing just as suddenly, only this time it wasn't water, it was human hands. The following week, the task force convened inside Belzoni's courthouse annex. Marcus pointed to the map. "The cluster is clear. The killer knows the river. They know who won't be missed right away." McAllister added, "We may be looking at someone with a base of operations, a farm, a camp, somewhere isolated. We need surveillance along the Yazoo." "Oh," Rachel leaned forward. "And we should ask, who benefits from silence? Who gains when these people disappear?" The room fell quiet. It was the first time the thought had been voiced. These were not accidents. They were choices. Someone had decided who lived and who vanished. As the meeting ended, Marcus lingered by the glowing pins on the map. Predators didn't stop until they were caught, and deep down, he feared this one had only just begun. By October of 2023, the task force believed they finally had someone to focus on. His name was Eddie Scarfo, a boat repairman on the edge of Belzoni. The shop looked ordinary from the road-rusting hulls pulled onto the bank, engines stacked in greasy piles, but everyone knew it doubled as a gambling den. Farmhands drifted there on payday, cards slapped on tables in the back, and Scarfo made his living lending money at crushing rates. The scar down his cheek gave him a permanent sneer, a warning not to cross him. His name surfaced when a fisherman came forward, saying he had seen Hank Dalton, one of the missing, arguing with Scarfo outside the River Bend bar. Hank had shouted about cheating at cards. Scarfo had jabbed a finger in his chest and promised to make him pay. To Marcus, it sounded like motive. Finally, a suspect who fit. Marcus and Rachel drove to the shop on a gray morning. Scarfo leaned against a skiff, cigarette glowing, gold chain flashing at his chest. "Sheriff's finest," he drawled. "Come to buy a boat or place a bet?" Marcus held out Hank's photo. "You know this man." Scarfo shrugged. "Sure, he owes everybody. Heard he lit out for Memphis. Not my problem." "You threatened him." Scarfo's smile widened. "People get mouthy after drinks. Threats don't make bodies." He was brought in for questioning. In the interview room, Scarfo sprawled in the chair, tapping his boots. Rachel slid photos across the table. Roy Jenkins, Martha Ellison, Slim Walker, Hank Dalton. "You crossed paths with more than one of these people. They're gone." Scarfo laughed. "Half the county's been through my tables. If they disappear, that's on them. I want money, not corpses." For hours, Marcus pressed, but Scarfo dodged with ease. He admitted to fights, debts, intimidation, nothing more. His record supported it: illegal gambling, assaults, but no homicide. Marcus left the room scowling. "He's hiding something," he muttered. The task force put Scarfo under watch. Plainclothes officers parked near his shop, followed his truck, noted the steady stream of gamblers. But weeks passed, with no sign he was tied to the vanishings. Then came a crack in the case. An old associate, Luther Briggs, admitted he had been with Scarfo the night Hank disappeared. Pressed hard, he described a card game in Greenville that turned into a brawl. Police had arrived, hauling several men into custody, including Scarfo. Marcus doubted him until Greenville PD faxed over the arrest log. There it was, Edward Scarfo, booked overnight, the same night Hank went missing. The alibi was airtight. At the next task force meeting, Marcus walked to the board where Scarfo's name was written bold. He drew a line through it. The room fell silent. Rachel whispered, "So, it isn't him." McAllister tried to lighten the blow. "It's progress, one less suspect." But Marcus felt no progress. He felt the weight of 13 families still waiting. The case had circled back to nothing. The disappointment spread quickly. Deputies who had hoped for resolution now slumped back into routine. At the diner, townsfolk murmured that the sheriff's men had wasted time. Some even laughed bitterly that the killer must be a ghost. Sheriff Callahan faced sharp questions at a county meeting. Angry voices demanded to know why Scarfo walked free. Callahan, sweating under the lights, promised answers soon, but his words rang thin. The community had wanted a villain, someone to point at. Now, with Scarfo eliminated, fear only deepened. One night, Marcus drove past the shop. Scarfo stood under the floodlight, cigarette glowing red. He raised a hand in a mocking salute. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter. Scarfo was guilty of plenty gambling, ruin, intimidation, but not of murder. And that realization chilled him. Because if Scarfo wasn't the predator, then the real one was still out there, moving silently along the river, choosing the next victim. Marcus stared into the darkness as he drove home, the weight of failure heavy on his chest. For the first time, he wondered if they were already too late. By November, the investigation was stuck like a truck in Delta mud. Weeks had been wasted chasing Eddie Scarfo, only to watch him walk free with a smirk. Deputies muttered about lost time. The press circled like buzzards, and Sheriff Callahan faced angry townsfolk demanding answers. 13 names were already on the board, and fear had sunk into the county like winter fog. Marcus Hale carried the weight hardest. Late nights found him at his kitchen table, maps spread wide, pins marking each disappearance. Red for men, blue for women, all clustered near the Yazoo River. He traced the bends with his finger, whispering to himself that somewhere along that black current lived the predator. But without proof, it was only a hunch, and hunches didn't save lives. The task force kept pushing. Deputies retraced old interviews, asking the same questions in different ways. Most witnesses had nothing new to add. People vanished in the Delta for all kinds of reasons, and memories blurred. It was Rachel who broke the silence. She had visited the widow of Harold Sutton, one of the latest victims. At first, the woman repeated the old story Harold had been drinking, maybe wandered off. But after gentle pressing, her voice trembled. "There was a man," she admitted. Came by the porch that evening, just before Harold left. Called himself Caleb. Said he had catfish ponds, told Harold to come by, drink a little, maybe lend a hand. Harold followed him straight down toward the river. "Oh," Rachel asked carefully. "Did you know this man?" The widow shook her head. "Never saw him before. Rough, strong-looking, boots caked in mud. Harold just called him Catfish Caleb." When Rachel shared the story back at the office, the room went quiet. A name. For the first time in months, there was a name tied to the very moment of a disappearance. Marcus leaned forward, voice low. "Say it again." "Caleb," Rachel repeated. "Catfish Caleb. Runs ponds somewhere off the river." They dug fast. County records showed Caleb Garrison, 52, originally from Arkansas. 6 years earlier, he had paid cash for nearly 10 acres along a secluded bend of the Yazoo. He built ponds for catfish, lived alone, no wife, no children, no hired help. He bought bulk supplies, feed, fuel, whiskey, always cash, never credit. Neighbors called him polite but distant, never joining church socials or town meetings. One man described him as the kind who watches more than he speaks. Marcus studied the file photo. Pale eyes, guarded expression. 10 acres of ponds with no crew? "That's not a farm, that's a fortress," he muttered. Surveillance began quietly. Deputies disguised as fishermen drifted by in boats, casting lines while binoculars watched the property. From the water they saw lean dogs patrolling the levees, barking at anything that moved. They saw Caleb himself, thick-shouldered, hauling feed sacks, checking nets, working from dawn until night. He rarely left, but when he did, it was by boat. One evening, a deputy reported seeing Caleb load 2 sacks onto a John boat, row across toward Belzoni, and return an hour later with another man known for drinking. They disappeared into the farmhouse. Later that night, deputies stationed downstream swore they heard the rumble of machinery carrying over the water, a grinding noise that stopped just before midnight. The man was never seen leaving. Marcus read the report with his jaw set. This was different from Scarfo, different from speculation. Here was a man, a place, and a method, yet still, no body, no direct evidence, only shadows. At the next meeting, Marcus pushed the file across the table. "This is our man. Look at the map. The disappearances ring his property like fence posts. He's hiding something in those ponds." McAllister raised a hand. "Slow down. Suspicion isn't proof. If we storm that farm and come up empty, the case collapses." He's cautious. He's had years to cover tracks. "We need something solid before we move." Rachel spoke quietly but firmly. "While we wait, people keep disappearing. How many more before we act?" The room divided. Some agreed with McAllister's caution, others with Rachel's urgency. Marcus sat in silence, staring at the photo of Caleb's ponds. He imagined the dark water rippling under the moonlight, secrets resting at the bottom. That night, Marcus drove the levee road alone. Across the reeds, a faint glow marked Caleb's farmstead. The sight chilled him. 10 acres of water, guarded by dogs, watched over by a solitary man who spoke to no one. It was the perfect hunting ground, hidden in plain sight. For the first time since the disappearances began, Marcus felt certainty. Catfish Caleb wasn't a rumor or a scapegoat. He was real, and Marcus knew in his bones that those ponds held more than fish. By December, the surveillance on Caleb Garrison's farm had become an endurance test. Deputies rotated through long, freezing nights in boats disguised as fishermen or in a makeshift hide built deep in the trees. From their posts they logged every move. Caleb up at dawn, walking the pond banks, carrying feed sacks on his back, his dogs pacing the levees. The notes filled pages, but none of it was enough. To an outsider, it looked like the routine of a hard-working fish farmer. To Marcus Hale, it looked like the cover of a predator. Patience was the hardest part. Marcus wanted action, and every report left him restless. He saw the missing in his mind: Roy, Martha, Slim, Janice, Hank, faces that hovered over his desk like ghosts. Now there was Caleb, and Marcus's instincts screamed he was the one. But instincts didn't hold in court. McAllister made sure to remind him of that. One icy evening, the task force gathered in the courthouse annex. Maps lined the walls, Caleb's property circled in red. Marcus leaned over the table, voice sharp. "You've all read the logs. Men walk into that place, and no one sees them leave. How many times do we watch this before we admit what's happening?" McAllister answered evenly. "Patterns aren't proof. You want an arrest. You need a body, DNA, a witness, something tangible. If we move now with nothing but sightings, the DA won't touch it. Caleb walks, and we lose him for good." "Oy." Rachel sat forward, her eyes fierce. "And what do we tell the families when another person disappears while we're waiting for the perfect piece of evidence?" The room splintered. Some deputies sided with Marcus and Rachel, driven by urgency. Others backed McAllister, worried that one misstep could sink the entire case. Sheriff Callahan tried to calm the argument, but looked more worried about headlines than strategy. That night, Marcus sat on his porch, staring into the bare fields. The wind rattled the shutters, and he thought of his father's words from flood season years ago. "You don't fight the river head-on, you wait for the shift, then you move." Maybe this case was the same, but waiting now felt like gambling with human life. A week later, tension spiked. A deputy stationed near the river swore he heard a scream carried on the wind from Caleb's direction. He trained his binoculars, but the farm was dark except for a single lamp burning in the shed. Moments later, the rumble of machinery drifted across the water, low and grinding, before cutting off abruptly. He radioed the report in, shaken. Marcus read it with a clenched jaw. To him, it was confirmation. To McAllister, still only sound in the night, easy to mishear, impossible to prove. But Rachel pressed him privately afterward. "Every day we hesitate, he tightens the noose. We have to make him slip." The surveillance dragged into late December. Deputies shivered in boats, their breath rising in the cold, binoculars fogging. They logged Caleb buying more feed than usual, hauling barrels into the shed, running equipment long after midnight. It was all smoke with no flame, but the sense of menace grew heavier with each shift. Then came a report that chilled them all. On Christmas Eve, Caleb ferried something across the river, 2 heavy bundles wrapped in canvas. The deputies couldn't see inside, only the way Caleb moved, straining as he dragged them into the shed. Lights glowed there until nearly dawn. When he emerged, the bundles were gone. At the next meeting, Marcus slammed the file on the table. "We can't ignore this. He's destroying evidence right under our noses." McAllister rubbed his forehead. "And still no body, no direct link. If we raid without grounds, a judge throws it out. He sues the county, and we look like fools. We need a legal way in something that gets us close without tipping him off." Rachel leaned forward. "Then we stop waiting for him to make a mistake. We create the opportunity." Silence followed. The idea was risky, approaching Caleb under some cover story, stepping onto that property while pretending to be something else. Dangerous, but it could yield the one thing they needed: hard evidence. Marcus looked around the room. The debate was over. The board full of missing names haunted him, and now they had a path forward, however perilous. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Then that's what we do. We go in, quiet, legal, and we bring back something the lab can't ignore." That night he drove the levee road, the winter moon shining on the empty fields. Across the river a faint light glowed from Caleb's farm. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter. The hunter was close, and soon they would step into his ground. There would be no turning back. The decision to approach Caleb Garrison's farm under a cover story came together in the final days of December. The courthouse annex was drafty that night, heaters rattling as the task force bent over maps and folders. Marcus Hale outlined the plan. A surprise agricultural inspection. McAllister had quietly secured cooperation from the state fisheries office, and with their help, the paperwork looked authentic: seals, signatures, and a reason no farmer could reasonably refuse. Disease checks on catfish ponds happened often enough in Mississippi. Caleb might not like it, but he would have to let them in. The team rehearsed every detail: badges clipped to jackets, sample kits arranged in boxes, a borrowed state truck parked out back. A real fisheries officer from Jackson agreed to accompany them, giving the operation the weight of legitimacy. Behind the scenes, a tactical unit waited across the river, ready to move if things turned dangerous. The line between law and theater had never felt thinner. On the morning of the inspection, frost glittered on the grass. Rachel checked her badge for the 3rd time, nerves betraying her calm exterior. "You think he'll believe this?" she asked. Marcus slid the folder of forged documents into his briefcase. "He doesn't have to believe it. He just has to let us work." They crossed the Yazoo in a john boat, the water sluggish under the winter Sunday. The farm came into view, ponds stretching like mirrors, reeds rustling along the levees. Then came the sound of dogs' deep, furious barking that carried across the water. Half a dozen mutts tore along the bank, teeth flashing. The farmhouse door opened. Caleb stepped out, tall and broad, his coat loose against the cold. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He only raised a hand, silencing the dogs with a snap of his fingers, then stood waiting as the boat scraped the bank. Marcus climbed first, briefcase in hand. "Morning, Mr. Garrison," he called evenly. "State fisheries inspection, routine check. We've had reports of parasites in catfish ponds. We need to take some samples." Caleb's eyes narrowed. He took the folder Marcus offered, flipping through the pages slowly, lips moving as he read. His thumb paused on one seal, tracing the ink. For a heartbeat, Marcus thought he had spotted a flaw. The air seemed to thicken, dogs circling with low growls. Finally, Caleb shut the folder. "Never had parasites here," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored. "That's why we check," Marcus replied, keeping his tone professional though his pulse thudded in his ears. For a moment longer, Caleb's gaze lingered on him. Then he jerked his head toward the ponds. "Do it quick, don't stir the fish." They walked the levees under Caleb's watchful eye. Rachel knelt by the water, dipping vials and labeling them with steady hands. The fisheries officer netted 2 catfish, explaining in technical jargon about oxygen levels and gill tissue. Caleb's expression softened slightly at the stream of scientific language he clearly didn't follow. Marcus stayed upright, clipboard in hand, pretending to check figures while scanning the property. He noted the shed with its heavy lock, the churned mud leading to its door, the faint smell of fuel. Every detail sharpened his certainty that this was no ordinary farm. When they had enough, Rachel sealed the vials. "We'll run these in Jackson," she said lightly. "Results usually come back within 2 weeks." Caleb gave only a curt nod. As they turned to leave, the dogs crowded close, hackles raised. Marcus forced himself to walk slowly, meeting Caleb's pale eyes one last time. They revealed nothing, but the silence between them was louder than the barking. The team reached the boat and pushed off. Only when the farmhouse shrank behind the trees did anyone allow themselves to breathe. Rachel let out a shaky laugh. "I thought those dogs were going to eat us alive." Marcus didn't laugh. He held the cooler of samples like treasure. "If there's anything in those ponds, the lab will find it." That night, the evidence was sealed and flown to Jackson. Marcus stayed late in his office, staring at the board of missing faces. For months they had been silent reminders. Now, perhaps, their truth would surface through the fish swimming in Caleb's ponds. It was a fragile hope, but more than they had ever held. And if the lab confirmed what Marcus feared, the hunt would shift at last from suspicion to proof. The samples went out overnight, packed in coolers with seals and signatures to prove every hand that touched them. For Marcus Hale, the waiting was unbearable. He filled his days with routine calls, but his mind kept circling back to those vials of water and the catfish now swimming in tanks at the state lab in Jackson. He told himself not to expect answers too soon, yet every ring of the phone made his chest tighten. On the 4th day, McAllister took a call, his face hardening as he listened. When he hung up, the room fell silent. "The results are ready," he said. "They want us in Jackson." The drive down Highway 49 was tense. Frost still clung to the fields, the sky low and gray. Rachel sat in the back seat, scribbling circles on her notepad, not writing words, just pressing the pen until the paper tore. McAllister tapped a slow rhythm on the armrest, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Marcus gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. No one dared to say what they were all thinking, that today they might finally learn what lay hidden in Caleb's ponds. At the Mississippi Forensics Institute, a technician ushered them into a conference room. A stack of papers waited on the table. The lead scientist, a woman with silver hair tied neatly back, adjusted her glasses before speaking. "We ran DNA amplification on your samples, water, sediment, and catfish tissue," she began. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed unease. "We detected human genetic material, multiple individuals." Rachel's breath caught. McAllister leaned forward. Marcus felt a hot denial rising in his throat, desperate to argue, but the scientist continued before he could speak. "We compared the sequences to the profiles you submitted from relatives of missing persons. There is a confirmed match to Harold Sutton, another to Janice Moore. Partial markers suggest at least 2 more. In plain terms, the fish had ingested human remains." The words hung in the air. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. McAllister exhaled slowly, as if bracing against a blow. Marcus lowered his eyes, the denial slipping away. The board of missing faces back in Belzoni was no longer a collection of question marks. It was evidence, swimming in Caleb Garrison's ponds. Back in Belzoni, the report lay at the center of the table as the task force gathered. Sheriff Callahan read aloud, voice shaking, each sentence driving the truth deeper. For months the town had whispered theories: wandering drunks, lost women, accidents. Now the reality was printed in black and white. Caleb wasn't just suspicious. He was a killer who had turned his farm into a graveyard. Anger boiled through the room. One deputy slammed his fist against the table. Another muttered a prayer. But McAllister raised his hand. "This is our warrant," he said firmly. "We move tomorrow. He's armed, isolated, and careful. We can't underestimate him." Plans took shape quickly. A SWAT unit would breach the farmhouse at dawn. Deputies would secure the sheds and ponds. Boats would cut off escape by river. Marcus demanded a place on the entry team. No one tried to talk him out of it. He had carried the weight of this case from the beginning. Now he would see it through. That night he sat in his living room, the report spread across his lap. The names of Harold and Janice leapt from the page, no longer just photos on a wall, but voices carried back from the water. He thought of their families, waiting for answers, and of the Christmas Eve bundles Caleb had dragged into his shed. The rage in Marcus's chest burned hot, but beneath it was sorrow for the years of silence, for the victims dismissed as outcasts until it was too late. Before dawn, the task force gathered on the riverbank, breath rising in the icy air. Kevlar vests were strapped on, rifles loaded. The SWAT commander gave crisp orders, his men listening without expression. Boats slid into the black water while trucks crept through the woods on the far side. Marcus stood apart for a moment, watching the eastern horizon lighten. He thought of his father again. Swept away by floodwaters years ago, a death no one could prevent. But Caleb was no force of nature. Caleb could be stopped. As the convoy moved out, dogs began to bark across the river, sensing what was coming. Marcus's pulse quickened. The waiting was over. They had proof, they had a warrant, and now they were coming for the man who had haunted the Delta for over a year. Whatever lay inside those sheds and beneath those ponds would finally be dragged into daylight. The raid began before dawn, the world still wrapped in silence. Boats slid across the Yazoo with their motors barely humming, while trucks rolled through the woods on the far side, headlights covered. Frost clung to the reeds along the levee. The plan was simple in theory. Surround the farm, strike fast, and leave Caleb Garrison no room to run. In practice, Marcus Hale knew nothing about this would be simple. He crouched in the bow of the lead boat, rifle balanced across his lap. Across the water, the farmhouse glowed faintly, a single porch bulb burning against the night. Then came the dogs' low growls rising into sharp barks echoing off the ponds. They knew. They always knew. "Position set," came the whisper over the radio. The SWAT commander's voice was steady, professional. Marcus glanced at Rachel behind him. She wasn't on the entry team, but she had insisted on being here to secure evidence once the property was cleared. Her jaw was tight, her notebook tucked into her vest. "You ready?" he asked softly. She nodded. "We've waited long enough." The boats nosed into the mud. Men fanned out along the bank, boots crunching frozen grass. The farmhouse loomed larger now, a shadow against the gray horizon. The commander lifted his hand, then dropped it. "Go." The yard erupted in chaos. Floodlights snapped on. Dogs lunged, teeth bared, before being driven back by officers with poles and nets. SWAT surged up the porch, the ram splintering the door in one blow. Voices thundered, "Sheriff's Department, warrant!" Marcus was on their heels, adrenaline surging. The interior was dark and cramped, furniture shoved against the walls. Rooms cleared, fast kitchen, bedroom, hall, empty. Then came the shout from outside, "Back shed! Movement!" Through the window, Marcus caught sight of a broad figure running across the yard. Caleb. His stride was heavy, his coat flaring, shotgun glinting in one hand. The dogs swarmed around him, wild with fury. He reached the shed, yanked at the chain on the door, then spun as the officers closed in. "Drop it, Caleb," Marcus bellowed. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked across the yard. Caleb's pale gaze was sharp, almost calm, as if he had been waiting for this. He raised the shotgun, and the night cracked with gunfire. Dirt sprayed near Marcus's boots. Officers returned fire, bullets thudding into the shed's siding, forcing him down. Marcus broke cover, sprinting low. He slid behind a tractor, heart hammering. Caleb was at the shed door now, jamming a key into the lock. His face was twisted with rage, but underneath it, Marcus saw something like satisfaction, like a man determined to show them his truth. "Don't do it," Marcus shouted again. The lock snapped open. The shed door swung wide, and a wave of stench rolled out, thick and rancid. Inside loomed a hulking machine, metal blades dull with grime, buckets stacked nearby with sludge caked along the rims. The sound of flies buzzed even in the winter air. Caleb turned back with the shotgun, but a SWAT officer hit him from the side. The gun went off once, harmlessly into the dirt, before 3 more piled on. Caleb thrashed, roaring curses, but the cuffs clamped shut at last. The dogs whined, circling helplessly as their master was pinned in the mud. "Suspect secure," came the call. Marcus stepped forward, chest heaving. He peered into the shed, bile rising in his throat. This was the sound they had heard at night, the grinding that carried across the river. Now it stood revealed, a tool not for farming but for hiding sins. He didn't need to see more. The stink told him enough. Rachel joined him, pulling gloves over trembling hands. She began bagging samples, not bothering with photos yet. "This is it," she murmured, voice hoarse. "We have him!" Deputies swept the rest of the farm. In the bedroom they found boxes of personal effects, worn wallets, cheap jewelry, scraps that had once belonged to the missing. By the ponds, nets dragged up fragments the eye couldn't mistake. Every corner of the property whispered of violence long concealed. Caleb himself was quiet now, mud streaking his face, hair hanging in clumps. When Marcus crouched in front of him, he muttered only once, "They were nothing. I was just cleaning up." Marcus felt fury surge, but he forced it down. "You'll answer for every one of them," he said, voice like stone. By sunrise, the property swarmed with law enforcement. Evidence teams cataloged, bagged, sealed. The shed stood open, its secrets no longer hidden. Caleb Garrison was hauled to a waiting truck, his pale eyes still burning but his hands shackled tight. Marcus turned once more to the ponds, their surface rippling gold under the morning light. For months they had guarded their secrets. Now, finally, those secrets would be laid bare in court. The jailhouse in Belzoni was a tired brick box with buzzing lights that cast more shadows than clarity. Inside the interrogation room, Caleb Garrison sat cuffed to the table. Mud still clung to his boots, and his thick shoulders filled the chair. He leaned back as if the place belonged to him, lips twitching in a faint smile that made Marcus Hale's skin crawl. Marcus entered with McAllister at his side, a folder tucked under his arm. He set it down, opened it slowly, and slid out a photograph of Janice Moore. "You remember her?" Marcus asked. Caleb's eyes flicked to the picture, then up again. "That one begged," he said, voice flat. "Begged till her throat went raw." Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept steady. He laid down another photo, Harold Sutton. Caleb tilted his head, a ghost of amusement in his eyes. "Followed me like a pup. Didn't take more than a bottle to reel him in." McAllister spoke next, calm, measured. "We've got DNA from your ponds, matches to them and more. You're finished." Caleb chuckled, a sound that carried no humor. "DNA? Fancy talk. Machines telling you what I already knew." He leaned closer, the cuffs clinking. "I did it. All of it. 30. Maybe more. You want me to count? I lost track years ago." The words dropped heavy into the stale air. Marcus felt a surge of rage. "Why them?" he asked, voice tight. Caleb shrugged. "Because nobody cared. Drunks, widows, strays, people. The world stepped around like trash in the gutter. You all noticed only when the numbers piled too high. I gave them purpose, fed the fish, kept my pond strong. That's more than they had before." Marcus slammed his fist against the table, the sound sharp in the small room. Rachel, who had been quietly taking notes at the corner, startled but quickly steadied herself. She leaned forward, eyes burning. "You murdered them, Caleb. You destroyed families." Caleb turned his gaze on her, studying her with that same pale detachment. "Families? Half of them were already left behind. You call it murder, I call it cleanup. Keeping balance." Rachel snapped back. "Balance doesn't mean grinding people into fish food." For the first time, Caleb's smile faltered, though only briefly. He leaned back, cuffs rattling. "You think you're better than me, but I did what everyone else thought and never said. Folks like them don't matter in towns like this. You know it." The room fell into a tense silence. Marcus felt the truth sting not Caleb's twisted reasoning, but the cruel fact that the victims had been ignored for too long. Still, he forced his voice steady. "You're not some force of nature, Caleb. You're a man who hid behind mud and ponds, and tomorrow you'll stand in court for every life you stole." Caleb stared back, eyes gleaming with something almost triumphant. Then he laughed, a rasping sound that echoed off the walls. "Court don't change what's already in the water. They're part of the river now. Can't take that back." After that he went silent, lips pressed tight, gaze fixed on the ceiling as if the room no longer existed. Marcus studied him one last time. Not for remorse, there was none, but to memorize the face of a man who believed cruelty made him powerful. Then he rose and walked out. Outside, Rachel sank into a chair, pale but composed. "He doesn't regret a thing," she said softly. Marcus's fists were still tight, but his voice was firm. "Regret doesn't matter. Proof does, and we have it." McAllister closed the file with a snap. "Tomorrow, the DA files multiple counts of murder. He'll never walk free again." Through the glass, Caleb sat alone, a hulking shadow under buzzing lights. For months he had haunted the Delta like a phantom. Now he was just another prisoner in chains, waiting for a trial that would strip away the last of his lies. The courthouse in Belzoni had never held so many people. By sunrise, the steps were crowded with townsfolk, reporters, and families of the missing, pressing against the barricades for a glimpse of the man at the center of it all. Inside, deputies filled the halls, their radios crackling as they led Caleb Garrison into the courtroom. Shackles clinked with each step, but his face remained blank, eyes sweeping the room as though he were an observer, not the accused. Marcus Hale sat near the front, suit crisp, but eyes shadowed from months of work. Rachel was beside him, pen poised though her hands trembled. McAllister leaned forward, steady as always, while Sheriff Callahan stood at the back, arms crossed, bearing the weight of a community desperate for justice. The judge entered, gavel striking once, and the room stilled. The prosecutor rose, her voice clear and unwavering. She spoke of men and women who had vanished, of DNA pulled from ponds, of belongings found in Caleb's bedroom. The state will show, she said, that Caleb Garrison lured vulnerable neighbors to his farm, ended their lives, and discarded them as though they were refuse. Today we restore their dignity with the only verdict that honors them, guilty. The defense, a weary, court-appointed lawyer, could offer little. He muttered about instability, about a mind unfit to stand trial. But his words fell flat against the weight of evidence. Witnesses came in steady procession. A forensic scientist explained the genetic matches, her pointer tracing lines on a chart that tied the fish in Caleb's ponds to missing sons and sisters. Deputies described the raid, the locked shed, the machine humming in the dark. Each detail added another stone to the mountain pressing down on the courtroom. Then the family spoke. Janice Moore's sister clutched a tissue, voice quivering. She was lonely, that's all. She just wanted someone to talk to. And he took her from us. Her sobs filled the silence. Harold Sutton's son followed, jaw clenched. My father wasn't perfect, but he deserved to die with a name, not become part of a pond. His glare cut toward Caleb, who sat still, hands folded, eyes distant, as if the testimony belonged to someone else's life. Marcus listened, throat tight. He had lived with these names on paper for so long, but hearing the grief in flesh and blood turned the weight almost unbearable. Rachel scribbled furiously beside him, though tears blurred her eyes. When Marcus took the stand, the prosecutor asked him to recount the investigation. He spoke of the first files, of tracing disappearances dismissed as coincidence, of nights staring at maps dotted with missing faces. He described the raid in clipped sentences, the barking dogs, the stench, the machine no farmer should need. He chose them, Marcus said, voice steady but heavy, because he thought no one would notice. But they mattered. Every one of them mattered. The defense declined to cross-examine. Caleb had confessed enough on his own. Closing arguments came swift. The prosecutor's voice carried to every corner of the packed room. These people were neighbors, not trash. The defendant preyed on their loneliness and weakness, and he did so, believing no one would care. This verdict is not only about punishment, it is about declaring that every life has value. We ask you to return the only just decision, guilty. The jury filed out, and hours of tense waiting followed. Families prayed, deputies paced, reporters whispered. Marcus stood by a window, staring at the square where he had once driven past posters of the missing. He thought of his father's words about the river, how it swallowed what it wished. But Caleb wasn't the river. Caleb was a man, and men could be judged. At last the jury returned. The foreman rose, paper trembling in his hand. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. The room erupted sobs, cries, gasps of relief. Rachel pressed her face into her hands. Sheriff Callahan exhaled hard, shoulders dropping as though a weight had slipped free. Families clutched each other, grief and solace mingling in the same tears. Caleb did not flinch. He sat shackled, eyes fixed on the ceiling, expression unreadable. The faint smirk that had haunted the interrogation room was gone. In its place was emptiness, as if even he knew the story was finished. The judge's gavel struck once more. Sentencing would follow, but the verdict was sealed. Caleb Garrison would never again walk free. As the crowd spilled into the cold sunlight, Marcus lingered. He looked once at the man who had turned ponds into graves, then turned away. Outside, Families embraced, townsfolk wept, and for the first time in months, Belzoni breathed without fear. Justice had not healed the wounds, but it had named them, and it had named the man who caused them. Winter lingered long after the verdict, its chill settling over Belzoni like a weight the town could not shake. The courthouse steps that had swarmed with reporters and families were now empty, the flags outside snapping in the wind. The streets were quieter, though not with peace. It was the silence that follows a storm, when people take stock of what remains. Marcus Hale drove the back roads, past ponds rimmed with ice, past cotton fields stripped to brown stalks. For months, every stretch of land had felt cursed, heavy with suspicion. Now the man behind it all sat in a cell, awaiting sentencing. Yet the relief Marcus had hoped for did not come. Instead, he felt a hollowness, as though justice had arrived too late to restore what was lost. One evening he stopped at the church where families had gathered through the long months of fear. Its windows glowed against the dark, and voices rose inside, singing hymns that wavered but did not break. Marcus slipped quietly into a back pew. He listened as Janice Moore's sister read from a worn Bible, her voice trembling. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." Heads bowed, shoulders touched, and for the first time Marcus felt the burden shift, not gone, but carried together. Outside, Rachel joined him, notebook tucked under her arm. The cold turned her breath to mist, but her eyes were steady. "They'll never stop grieving," she said. "But at least the silence is over." Marcus nodded. "And maybe the next time someone goes missing, people won't look away so easily." They walked down the steps together, the church bell tolling behind them. Rachel hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered between them for weeks. "Do you think he really believed what he said, that he was helping somehow?" Marcus thought of Caleb in the interrogation room, the calm voice, the twisted pride. "I think he believed whatever he needed to. Lies big enough to live inside." That's how he kept going. Sheriff Callahan met them at the curb, his coat collar pulled up against the wind. "Sentencing set for 3 weeks," he said. "Life, maybe worse. But this town's got scars now. We'll carry him for a while." Later, Marcus returned to his office. The board of missing faces still hung on the wall. Slowly, carefully, he removed each photo and placed it into an envelope marked with the victim's name. These would be delivered to the families not as evidence now, but as remembrance. When the board was bare, Marcus sat in the quiet, staring at the cork. He thought of the first photo he had tacked up, Roy Jenkins, and how no one had believed then that it meant anything. The circle had closed, though not neatly. Rachel appeared in the doorway. "Don't tell me you're planning another all-nighter." Marcus smiled faintly. "Just finishing what I started. End of tree." She stepped in, looked at the empty board, and touched the edge. "You gave them answers. That matters." The following weekend, the town gathered at the levee for a vigil. Candles glowed in paper cups, their light trembling in the cold. Families stepped forward, one by one, speaking the names of their lost. Each time the crowd answered together, "We remember." For those overlooked in life, the affirmation rang like a promise. Marcus stood among them, not apart as investigator but as neighbor. The wind off the river cut sharp, yet the warmth of the candles spread through the night. He thought of Caleb's ponds, drained and fenced, the land left barren. The horror would never be erased, but neither would the resolve it spark. As the vigil ended, Marcus looked out across the dark Yazoo. The river still carried secrets, as it always had, but now the town had claimed its own truth. The names would not vanish. The people would not forget. Driving home, Marcus rolled down the window and drew a deep breath of cold air. For the first time in months, the road ahead seemed open. The scars of Belzoni would remain, but so would the lesson. No life was too small to matter, and no silence could be allowed to hide the next cry for help. The frost was still heavy on the levee when Marcus Hale pulled into the sheriff's lot that Monday morning. The trial was finished, sentencing only weeks away, yet the name Caleb Garrison lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Marcus had hoped for quiet time to file reports and let the town breathe. But quiet never lasted long in the Delta. Rachel was already at her desk, folders stacked high. She looked up as Marcus entered, brushing her hair back from tired eyes. "I thought we'd finally get a breather," she said. Marcus dropped a thin file in front of her. "Not today. Highway Patrol found an abandoned pickup outside Yazoo City. Blood on the seat, Driver never made it home. Rachel opened the file quickly. Harold Kemp, 54, runs a repair shop, divorced, lives by himself. She hesitated, frowning. This feels too familiar. Marcus nodded. It's not Garrison, he's locked down tighter than Fort Knox, but people are already whispering. You know how it goes. The whispers had begun even before Marcus left home. At the diner that morning, farmers hunched over their coffee had murmured about another one gone. Voices low but certain. Fear made easy stories, and in Belzoni, stories traveled faster than fact. Sheriff Callahan stepped into the office, hat in hand. "We'll treat it clean," he said firmly. "Follow the leads, no chasing ghosts." But the town's rattled. They think monsters always come in pairs. By afternoon, Marcus and Rachel were driving the highway where the truck had been found. Winter fields stretched gray on either side, ponds glazed with ice. The pickup sat on the shoulder, a strip of tape fluttering in the cold wind. A patrol officer stood nearby, boots crunching frost. Marcus ducked into the cab. The metallic tang of blood hit him first. Stains darkened the seat, the dash smeared faintly. The radio still hummed static, and a styrofoam cup sat half full in the holder, coffee long gone cold. No body, no footprints outside. Just absence, unsettling in its simplicity. Rachel stood by the truck bed, arms wrapped tight against the wind. "It's like he vanished mid-drive," she murmured. Marcus scanned the horizon. Or someone wanted it to look that way. They canvassed nearby stops. A clerk remembered Harold at the gas station the night before, filling a thermos and buying cigarettes. A farmhand swore Harold mentioned money troubles, bills piling since the shop closed. Bits and pieces, nothing solid yet, but enough to sketch the outline of a man under strain. Back at the sheriff's office, phones rang with speculation. Some insisted it was a copycat. Others whispered about accomplices. Marcus repeated the facts calmly. Caleb was caged. This was a different case. Still, he knew the shadow of Garrison would stretch over every disappearance for years to come. Late in the evening, Marcus sat at his desk, the new file open beside the box of photos he had packed away after the trial. Rachel leaned in the doorway, watching him. "You think this ties back to Caleb?" she asked. "I think fear makes folks connect dots that don't belong together," Marcus said. Then, quieter, "But we can't afford to dismiss anything either." Rachel crossed the room, setting her hand on the file. "That's how it started last time, one man gone, then another. We didn't take it serious until it was too late. I'm not making that mistake again." Before Marcus could answer, the phone rang. A deputy's voice crackled. Harold's wallet had been found 2 miles from the truck, tossed in a ditch. License still there, family photos intact, but the cash was gone. Rachel scribbled notes, her brow furrowed. "Robbery? Maybe," Marcus said. "Or staged to look like it." The office emptied as night deepened, but Marcus stayed behind. The hum of the heater filled the quiet while his thoughts wandered back to the interrogation room, Caleb's pale eyes, his rasping claim of cleaning up. Marcus shut the memory out. This was not Caleb. This was something new. Still, as he closed the file and switched off the light, he felt it the echo of a truth he could not shake. The Delta had not been cleansed by one verdict. It was wide and shadowed, a place where men had disappeared long before Caleb Garrison and where they would again. And so the work continued.